Okay.
Hello, and welcome to the Global Leaders Dialogue, an event organized by the UN Population Fund, UNFPA, to mark the 20th anniversary of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. I'm Dominique Day. I chair the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, a fact-finding body mandated by the UN Human Rights Council to investigate and report on the situation of people of African descent globally. Our theme today, People of African Descent, A Journey Toward Equality, focuses specifically on the progress and challenges in implementation of the Durban Program of Action. This includes, in particular, efforts to ensure the social, political, economic, and cultural rights of people of African descent. It is my honor to moderate this dialogue with a group of superstars whom I will take a moment to introduce now. First, Dr. Natalia Kennem, Executive Director of the United Nations Population Fund. Ms. Susana Baca, former Minister of Culture of Peru, who was a singer, songwriter, and activist with cultural interests. His Excellency Professor Gerardo Maloney, a former ambassador who's a sociologist, writer, educator, Panamanian filmmaker, and activist. Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, a distinguished academic, international thought leader, UN committee official, and global public activist in the field of social justice and minority empowerment. Dr. Marta Morena Vega, a respected scholar, producer, activist, educated author, professor, Yoruba priestess, and founder of the Caribbean Cultural Center, African Diaspora Institute. And Ana Paula Barreto, activist and researcher on the intersections of race, gender, global health, and the arts. She's the Transnational Birth Equity Director for the National Birth Equity Collaborative. So let's open this dialogue with remarks from UNFPA Executive Director, Dr. Natalia Kennem. Dr. Kennem, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you so much, Dominique, for the introduction and also for the work that you are doing towards equality. I'd also like to thank everyone who's joining us, especially online, virtually. This dialogue promises to be very exciting. And I'm very happy to be here among the esteemed panelists. This is a conversation that is timely. It's a conversation that is much needed. And the road ahead must lead to a world that is more just, more equitable. That is the future we all want for people of African descent. I extend a special welcome to the esteemed panelists. Very proud to have Vice Chancellor Sir Hilary, Professor Maloney, Dr. Marta Vega, Ana Paula Barreto, and of course, Susana Baca, who has been a keeper of the flame of Afrodescendiente musical traditions. Really delighted to be here with all of you. Distinguished participants, dear friends, last week was a wonderful, momentous, unforgettable occasion for people of African descent and for the journey that we are taking to advance in the spirit of recognition, in the spirit of justice, and of development. What I saw was that spirit unwavering during the first ever International Day for People of African Descent, which I celebrated in Costa Rica, where we honored the extraordinary cultural contributions of the African diaspora and reinforced the urgent need to take action to end racism, to end marginalization, and the systemic discrimination of people of African descent. And just last month, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution. It establishes the permanent forum of people of African descent. The General Assembly did this unanimously during a high-level meeting marking the midterm review of the International Decade for People of African Descent, which ends in 2024. And we are building momentum as this decade comes to a conclusion. We need to engage in dialogue, such as we are today, regarding where do we go from here through 2024 and beyond. How do we move from words on the page towards action that's accelerated, and how do we harness our collective efforts and gather others to join us as we deliver the future we want? So this dialogue is going to explore these questions. We're going to examine our progress, but also take stock of what needs to be done towards full implementation of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action that was adopted 20 years ago at the landmark World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa. So I'm looking forward to hearing your ideas, your thoughts, your contributions, as together we continue a collective quest for justice, for equality, for dignity, for our communities, ensuring that no one is left behind once and for all. Thank you so much, Dominique, and back to you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Kennem, and for setting the stage for this conversation. And thank you also for your important work. So we're now going to dive into our moderated dialogue. Each member of the panel will have 6 minutes to answer a question, and we'll ask panelists to please stay within your allotted time to give everyone the chance to have meaningful participation, and so we can get to a second round. So Dr. Beckles, we will start with you. 20 years ago, Professor Beckles, the Durban Declaration requested states to invest in communities of African descent. Among other sectors, it included education. As an educator and as a thought leader in this area, what are your views on the progress that has been made to ensure communities of African descent have access to quality education? You're still on mute, Dr. Beckles.
Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you, Dominique. Thank you, all colleagues. Tremendous honor and pleasure to be a part of this program and to reflect on where we have reached since Durban 2001. In respect of the issue of access to education, higher education especially, access to college, university, skills training and professional development. I need to make one or two general statements on the theme. First of all, we recognize from the historical evidence that the African journey through Western modernity has been characterized by a massive criminal de-education experience, and that the African population was de-educated, it was de-skilled, and it was deprofessionalized, and that was the objective of the structures of colonial exploitation of enslaved African labor. So the general process was that millions of Africans went through a 400 or 500 year period of being de-skilled, being de-educated, and in fact, being afraid for education, because mass illiteracy in the various languages of the colonizers was the projected policy norm. So Africans were not expected to demonstrate literacy, numeracy, or to show intellectual proclivity. And all of those were very dangerous indeed from the point of view of such an African being seen as part of a resistance strategy. So Africans, therefore, were placed in this long intergenerational process of being placed in a context where to express intellectual capacity was dangerous. It was criminalized, and therefore Black people generally were detached from the educational structures and systems. And thus we we have this massive problem at the moment with the state of condition in respect to access to education by Black people across the Atlantic world. Here in the Caribbean, for example, where I am an educator, I'm involved in driving access revolution to education in general. The Black people in the Caribbean, within the context of the hemisphere, we have the lowest enrollment in higher education. So if you take Alaska to Argentina, the entire hemisphere, and we look at where this region is with a massive 80% African descendant population, this group of people within the age cohort 18 to 30, which is the younger generation, the young people have the lowest enrollment in higher education in the entire hemisphere. And we're speaking about young Black people in a hemisphere that is galloping towards economic transformation, digital development, professional training, access to technical and other artistic intellectual skills. So within the context of skills access, professional development, academic training, we continue 100+ years after emancipation to be in a situation of being at the bottom of access to education in the hemisphere. Now, I am sure that in the US context, in the South, in those post-plantation economies, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and so on, I'm sure the data would give us the same circumstance, as the data would point to the same situation in Brazil and other parts of Latin America, Colombia, and so on. So in the Atlantic world, Black people are generally outside of the mainstream, detached from access to education, professional development, and skills training, despite intergenerational development since emancipation. So this was a problem that was discussed at Durban. This was the issue that was addressed at Durban. This was the resolution. There was a resolution focused around that concept, that the only way that the Black people of the world and the Americas in general are going to have community development, family development, and to build up the infrastructure of Black civilization was access to education and public health, and the two are connected. We did not see any significant movement, simply because there has been a major pushback. There is no doubt that the Western nation states, the post-colonial states, the states that on chattel slavery, there is a tremendous pushback and indifference among these states. And we see this in the years since Durban. So post-Durban, I would say that the response by states across the Atlantic world and beyond, that the response has been anemic. There has been no enthusiasm. There has been no policy framework that drives this agenda. And what we're looking at is resistance to the philosophy and the culture embedded in the Durban Declaration. It is still a palpable objection among the corporate class, among the leaders of the nation state, to address this fundamental issue. And we see this everywhere that we have examined and collected data. So it is clear that we are going to need more than a decade to deal with the African descendant issue. We're going to need a second decade. And we're advocating that the 1 decade is, given the resistance, given the depth of the problem, given the enormity of the problem, it will take 10 years even to thaw the resistance and begin to turn this around, to have action in the subsequent decades. So those of us who are in the activist agenda are pushing for a second decade. We are calling for a very frank conversation in the UN, that is the custodian of the Durban Declaration, to have a deep dive to get to the bottom of what has been going on since Durban. I know that conversation is likely to happen at the UN next week, and we are asking many of our leaders who are going to have access to the floor of the General Assembly to insist upon these things. This is a matter of the democratic rights of African peoples in the 21st century. And therefore, the reparatory justice agenda has to be the critical focus around which this matter of access to education is addressed. It has to be placed at the center of a reparatory justice framework, that this is about reparations, access to development, community development, intergenerational development, access to assets of wealth, to end the plunder, to repair the plunder that has been taken out of the community so that communities can also self-repair. So all of this is an integrated dialogue, and at the heart of it is access to education and good public health care. The two cannot be separated. One leads to another. If you are not properly educated, you would not understand the need to take care of public health. If you're not properly educated in terms of the basic sciences of how the body functions, of how one should take care of nutrition and one's health, then the pandemic of chronic diseases that has ripped through the Black community of the Americas, that is a consequence also of not being able to self-repair because you don't have the tools to do so. So if we take the simple criterion of chronic diseases, let's say the chronic diseases criterion, if you take that one simple criterion, then the Black people of this hemisphere are the sickest people in the world. The Black people in this hemisphere, using the criterion of non-communicable chronic diseases, hypertension, diabetes, and so on, we are the sickest people in the world because of this. And therefore, a lot of work has to be done. We have not made any significant progress to speak of, and it has to be shouldered to the wheel and pressing on for another decade. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Beckles. And I invite everyone to think about what it means, as Dr. Beckles says, that this anemic response to the right to education, to the call for education in Durban, education, the core transmission of knowledge, has been so wholly criminalized, disinvested in, stripped of people of African descent. So thank you for that important intervention. I'd like to turn now to Ms. Susanna Baca and ask a question of you. At the time of the acceptance of your post as a cabinet minister in 2011, you vowed to combat discrimination against Indigenous peoples and peoples of African descent. As we mark the 20th anniversary of Durban, can you reflect on what progress has been made in the implementation of the Durban Program of Action in your country, in Peru?
Buenos días a todos, repito. Agradezco sobre todo la oportunidad de compartir este panel con ustedes, que pienso que ustedes están en la misma, mantienen esta voluntad de expresarse desde sus experiencias y sobre nuestras esperanzas, sueños y nuestro entorno latinoamericano. Y a la pregunta que me hicieran en el panel sobre mis promesas de combatir la discriminación contra los pueblos indígenas afrodescendientes al asumir la cartera de ministra, yo tuve el desafío como ministra de Cultura, bajo mi portafolio, un estamento fundamental como es el Viceministerio de Interculturalidad, que se plantea y lo hace por mandato de la Constitución Nacional, la visibilidad de los pueblos afrodescendientes, amazónicos e indígenas. Todo esto, todos estos designios políticos convergían, tenían un eje común: la lucha contra la discriminación y el combate a la exclusión social, cultural y económica. Así empezamos nuestra gestión. En poquísimos días se inició un diálogo intercultural. Nuestra agenda comprendió la reunión a nivel de ministerio en todos los estamentos del ministerio, con la presencia de los representantes de todas las comunidades asignadas para este diálogo. Y todo parecía que se encaminaba por muy buen camino, ¿no? Nuestra agenda de principios en ese momento era una clara muy clara. Debíamos luchar por la ley de consulta previa. ¿Qué significa esta ley? Yo creo que todos sabemos, pero puedo decirles que es una ley muy importante en mi país. En esos momentos había ocurrido una desgracia enorme. Había habido un enfrentamiento de una comunidad amazónica con la policía. Ellos pedían que fueran consultados para hacer cualquier trabajo dentro de su comunidad, en el área de su comunidad, en el terreno de su comunidad. Entonces, las petroleras, las compañías mineras tenían que reunirse con la comunidad y manifestarles cuál iba a ser el trabajo. Ellos tenían la inquietud de la contaminación del medio ambiente. Entonces, no, desde el gobierno central dieron 2 decretos y punto, y la gente se molestó muchísimo. Entonces, la ley de consulta previa daba vueltas en el Congreso, y felizmente en ese año, en el 2011, se aprobó por unanimidad en el Congreso. Y me tocó a mí, como Ministerio de Cultura, hacer la implementación, que la ley se pueda formalizar, ¿no? No sé qué otras palabras usar, pero que esta ley se haga ley y la gente tenga derecho a manifestarse en contra o a favor de la intervención en sus comunidades. Entonces, también vimos que el rol de la educación en la prevención de los prejuicios raciales y la necesidad de garantizar el progreso en la integración de la perspectiva de género en las medidas y programas adoptados para enfrentar el racismo, la discriminación racial, la xenofobia y otras formas conexas de intolerancia, como dice Durban. La creación del Observatorio contra el Racismo. Apenas yo regresé de la reunión, después de Durban, fue la reunión de Brasil, y yo regresé de ahí y que asistí a esa reunión representando a mi país como ministra y representando inclusive al presidente, porque él no pudo asistir. Entonces, había un gran entusiasmo por esto. Pensábamos que íbamos a lograr muchas cosas. Se propuso a mi regreso, que la creación del Observatorio contra el Racismo, contar con datos estadísticos desagregados para la formulación e implementación de políticas públicas contra el racismo. Pero al salir del ministerio, estas cosas se quedaron allí y bueno, los otros ministros han ido poco a poco trabajando en esto, pero yo he tenido muchísima esperanza de haber logrado que el racismo se haga cada vez menos en nuestro país, pero eso no ha sucedido. Al contrario, a mí me ha tocado ser ahora miembro del Tribunal de Honor del Pacto Ético en las elecciones del Perú, y he podido ver de cerca las veces que se ha ¡ay, qué terrible! Discriminado a la mujer por ser mujer, discriminado a la gente que viene de los pueblos indígenas por la manera de hablar, y han querido cambiar el rumbo de las elecciones, ¿no? inventando una serie de cosas. Entonces, yo llego a la conclusión de que hemos avanzado poco. Y es como decía el anterior panelista, el profesor Hilary, que la educación es fundamental para lograr que en nuestros países se deje de discriminar a la gente por su creencia, por su color de piel, por su manera de hablar. Y entonces tenemos que en estos momentos, en estos tiempos de la pandemia, requiere agrandar nuestra misión y que las luchas por la igualdad y la búsqueda de una política total de intolerancia o al racismo debe expandir su mirada a luchar contra la insolidaridad de las ciudades desarrolladas respecto a los pueblos no desarrollados o menos desarrollados, ya que este rasgo más significativo en un país como el Perú, donde más de una política oficial de discriminación a un negro, a un indio o a un amazónico, es la indolencia de una población que permite y crea a otros como no iguales, y que estos últimos pudieran vivir miseria, hambruna, educación deficiente, formación deficitaria. El no acceso a las tecnologías ni a la salud. Había que desarrollar primero políticas de inclusión general que sean sentidas por los amplios sectores de la población general del Perú, y así, solo así, desarrollar políticas de lucha con los males de la discriminación, que son el racismo y la segregación al interior de estas mismas comunidades.
Thank you, Ms. Varga. So thank you very much. Our working group did a country visit to Peru right before the pandemic, and I think we really saw firsthand what you've talked about, which is the commitment that one person can show in bringing and leading change, and how that shifts, how individual leadership makes a big difference, but the lack of a cohesive race analysis can really limit the progress a country or a community can make. And we thank you for your work, having seen some of it firsthand. All right, why don't we continue with our panel? Dr. Marta Moreno Vega, perhaps I could ask you a question in a moment. Let me start by introducing sort of the second major theme here. The Durban Declaration recognizes the value of cultural heritage of Africans and people of African descent. You have done extensive work for the preservation and expansion of knowledge of African diaspora tradition. How can we use this cultural heritage to advance the Durban agenda specifically, and to advance equality and rights for people of African descent more generally? Dr. Vega. And also, Dr. Vega, you are on mute. You can unmute yourself. Or perhaps the moderator can help and unmute Dr. Vega.
I think I did it. Muy buenos días, good day. I speak to you from Puerto Rico, a colony of the United States. I think that I would like to address some of the points made, so I can then address what the question is. I think that one of the assumptions that we make is that education was created to educate us. As a professor, as a university professor, as a cultural activist, one of the realities is that education, or the educational system, was not designed to educate us. As Sir Beckles said, we have been through a process of miseducation and de-education. So that if we're going to speak about change, we have to speak about systemic process of building Europeans, building institutions to maintain white supremacy, to maintain privilege. And the question becomes, what institutions are we building in the process to assure that we can pass on the cultural intelligences that our people have brought? And how then does that influence our seeing ourselves differently, our being able to structure different strategies that will empower us? We have to understand, like in the United States and throughout the world, eugenics, a science was developed to prove that we are not intelligent. And that premise and that thinking still exists. If we look at the recent happenings within the United States, the suppression of the vote, the suppression of education, critical race theory, teaching of history of our people, in 2021 is an absolute crime. So that when we speak about education, we have to be clear as to what education are we speaking about. Do we control it? What education do we control for our young adults, so that they can see themselves differently, identify their intelligence and their right to being human? So the process of culture is critical, and we can't put it aside as a thing. The way we see ourselves, the way we understand the food that we eat, the way that we understand the intelligence that our people have brought and continue to practice, almost invisible to some of us, right? And I've been privileged, and I say I've been privileged because growing up in East Harlem, my parents coming from Puerto Rico, a colony, insisted that I was beautiful and Black. And in that process, insisted that I travel. So the opportunity to travel to Africa, to see ourselves in Trinidad, to see ourselves in Brazil, to see ourselves in Santo Domingo, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and I could go on. You see a continuity of aesthetics, you see a continuity of aesthetic thought, you see a continuity of intelligence in terms of how you use nature to heal. Because we all come from tropical countries, from countries where the earth has nourished us. And in the process, we have to understand, as I said before, and I think that we have to put that at the center of our discussion, the institutions that have been developed to keep us marginalized, to keep us from gaining the wealth that we worked for under enforced labor for European colonial powers. And that is still a process in 2021, because where we were outlawed from owning land in Brazil, where we were outlawed from owning land in Puerto Rico and in Cuba, right? Now in the United States, for example, redlining doesn't allow you to gain wealth with the purchases that you have. Because if you buy a home in a community, automatically the value of the properties go down. So that there is a system in place that we have to call out. We have to call out colonialism and the ravages of colonialism and white supremacy. We have to call out the miseducation of our young, the purposeful miseducation of our young. Once I understood that process, being a public school teacher, have been intentional in building community-based cultural organizations, because we have to start somewhere. I don't stop being a professor, but I also understand that we have to develop those sacred spaces, those safe spaces that teach our own, that nourish our own, that say to our young, you are powerful and beautiful, that say to our young, you are intelligent. And if we don't do that, who will?
Thank you, Dr.
I can't argue that white supremacy continues to want its power, but I have to argue that we need to gain our power. And I'm not sure that it's within those systems that purposely were built to keep us poor and on the margins.
Thank you.
So that
Dr.
we have to
Vega.
rethink how we think.
Yeah.
And part of that process, and I'll close with that, and part of that process is that we have maintained sacred thought. And if you go to Trinidad, you go to Brazil, you go to Jamaica, you go to Santo Domingo, invisible to the general public are traditions that maintain that intelligence, that maintain that way of thinking, of building community, of sustaining community, and using nature as healing powers. So how is it that we don't incorporate that into strategy for liberation? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vega. And it's always such a pleasure to be on a panel with you, because I think your work really exposing and dismantling and offering new imaginations around the systems of our lives is so important and so foundational. And you do it in community. So thank you for your work.
For the opportunity.
So I think we have Professor Maloney now. If just to remind everybody, we've been talking with Professor Maloney about the underrepresentation or absence of people of African descent from decision-making spaces, including the decisions that structure our lives. And Professor Maloney, please help us understand what measures can be taken by government to ensure full and meaningful participation of people of African descent. Professor Maloney.
Bueno, a mí me gustaría antes que nada situarme frente a todo este proceso para poder comparar realmente y hacer una evaluación de lo que ha sido la evolución del movimiento a partir del compromiso de la Declaración de Durban y el Plan de Acción. Mi referencia es la década del 70 y 80 en América, cuando se produjeron los Congresos de Cultura Negra de las Américas, el primero por Manuel Zapata Olivella, que retomaba lo que había sido la efectividad de los congresos y la visión global de Marcus Garvey, sus famosos congresos. Entonces, en esa década, Zapata reinicia este proceso y se hace en Cali el primer Congreso de Cultura Negra de las Américas. Luego, en 1980, se hace en Panamá y en el 83 se hace en Brasil. Y por primera vez diríamos que nos dimos cita intelectuales, escritores, investigadores, lo más destacado que había en el continente en ese momento. Estoy hablando, por ejemplo, de Rex Nettleford de Jamaica, Edward Camus Brathwaite, estoy hablando de Jean Casimir de Haití, estoy hablando de Nicomedes y Victoria Santa Cruz del Perú, estoy hablando de Robert Allen y Robert Hill de los Estados Unidos, de Nelson Estupiñán Vaz y Salomón Chalá del Ecuador, de Eulalia Bernard de Costa Rica, Armando Crisanto Meléndez de Honduras, Armando Entralgo de Cuba, Bryce Laporte de Estados Unidos, aunque panameño. Yo creo que ese momento fue tan decisivo porque nosotros diseñamos una hoja de ruta para tratar de encontrar respuesta a los problemas y los padecimientos de los afro a nivel de todo el continente. Obviamente que para nosotros que fuimos actores durante ese proceso, cuando se aprueba y se hace la conferencia de Durban, el impacto fue grande porque nos dábamos cuenta que los estados de todo el mundo habían adquirido un compromiso para unirse formalmente a una lucha que había sido el principio rector de la vida de muchos de nosotros. Entonces, creo que es importante tener claro que el plan de acción de Durban, a pesar de establecer compromisos de tipo económico, sociales, políticos y culturales, estos compromisos no han alcanzado los niveles esperados. Sin embargo, los avances han sido significativos. En la mayor parte de algunos estados y por la actuación responsable de Naciones Unidas, y la propia comunidad afrodescendiente, ha habido transformaciones significativas. Por ejemplo, hay estados en donde a partir de Durban se han logrado espacios institucionales por ley dentro del estado, como es el caso de Brasil, Ecuador, Panamá, Costa Rica y Colombia. Durban también ha representado un fortalecimiento interesante de los movimientos sociales afrodescendientes. En Centroamérica, por ejemplo, la existencia ONECA y el papel de coordinación que se da a nivel, sobre todo el movimiento de las bases afrodescendientes en la región, es bien importante. La articulación y el crecimiento de las organizaciones de mujeres negras en el continente también es un resultado de Durban. El desarrollo de organizaciones de jóvenes en el continente también, yo creo que también es un logro bien importante que muestra un nivel de maduración importante de los afrodescendientes. Es también importante cómo Durban ha influido, por ejemplo, en que países que han tenido siempre una población afro, pero que no le prestaban ningún tipo de importancia, empiezan a darle la connotación y el valor que esto se merece. Me refiero al caso de México, por ejemplo, el caso de Bolivia y el caso de El Salvador, por ejemplo. Yo creo que son aspectos muy puntuales de maduración y ampliación de lo que es el movimiento en su esencia dentro de las bases de la sociedad civil. Obviamente que también importante la influencia que ha tenido Durban sobre el desarrollo de los niveles de conciencia en lugares en Europa, especialmente España, por ejemplo. España en los últimos años ha desarrollado un nivel de organización muy importante, coordinado con América Latina, pero también coordinado con los propios países africanos. Creo que en ese sentido ha influido mucho los efectos de la campaña de Black Lives Matter, ¿no? La virtualidad, producto de la pandemia, le ha proporcionado también a las redes sociales un papel central en la visibilización del problema del racismo y la discriminación, abriendo un espacio importante para una cantidad de eventos académicos y culturales, pero también de denuncias y actos de solidaridad. Sin embargo, me parece que muy influido por el diseño también, los logros más importantes durante todo este periodo ha sido el fortalecimiento de la identidad, es decir, el reconocimiento, rescate de lo que son nuestras herencias culturales directamente de África. Esto ha sido, a mi juicio, de gran valor porque ha estimulado el desarrollo de una conciencia étnica, que quizás es uno de los resultados bien importantes durante todo el diseño de Durban. Sin embargo, el hecho de que el mayor énfasis ha sido en lograr estimular y fortalecer la conciencia, yo creo que ha hecho que no se haya priorizado con el mismo carácter lo que eran las medidas y las metas de carácter social, las demandas sociales en materia de educación, en materia de tecnología, en materia de salud. En todo caso, me dicen que, bueno, creo que la pandemia demostró que el efecto de que los estados no le hayan puesto suficiente valor, importancia, y haber decidido realizar políticas interculturales en donde se produzca un respeto a la ciudadanía independientemente de la condición étnica, creo que la pandemia mostró los niveles de desigualdad que todavía existen en la región y que es importante superar. Creo que lo que
Thank you, Dr.
en la
Maloney.
conformación
Thank you.
o la creación de un nuevo sistema mundial, la igualdad, la democracia y la sostenibilidad deben ser pilares centrales en cualquier estrategia de resolver los problemas de intolerancia, discriminación y racismo que todavía persiste en el continente y en el mundo.
Thank you, Dr. Maloney. And thank you for this important intervention. I think we have seen in the pandemic the impact of decision-making that excludes people of African descent from meaningful participation, and the importance, as you say, of looking at it in very local context. I think at this point, we'd like to bring in our final panelist, Ana Paula Barreto. Welcome. And let me just offer you this to reflect upon. Women and girls suffer multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, and we've seen how that perpetuates a cycle of intergenerational poverty. Empowering women and girls, including through access to quality sexual and reproductive health rights, is a powerful tool to end this cycle and contributes to the advancement of the Durban agenda. In what ways can governments and civil society organizations support the empowerment of women and girls of African descent?
Thank you so much, Dominique. It's truly an honor to participate in such a crucial discussion. This is a highly important question, as the states have the responsibility to protect and to promote our human rights, and civil society actors are key stakeholders in the development of a comprehensive response to the advancement of the Durban agenda, as well as the International Decade for People of African Descent. And I would like to share a couple of comments regarding to this point. In my opinion, the collection of disaggregated data is key when we are thinking about the different oppressions and the multiple and intersection forms of inequalities and discriminations that women and girls face. Is it important to fight the structural discrimination and racism, and governments needs to take disaggregated data as part of their natural or regular strategic planning that they do every year. By promoting a national and a local strategic planning that adds disaggregated data, states are making what is invisible visible. And we all know the impacts of racism globally. However, when we are looking at disaggregated data, we can see how deep and how cruel the systems of oppressions are and how they affect the daily lives of our people every day. And when we are thinking about income, wealth, education, health, access to justice, or even dignity. Disaggregated data brings light to the maintained segregation, exclusion, and inequality that many of our communities face every day. States should also recognize their historical responsibilities and actions regarding to structural systems of oppression of the past and of today. The history of slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, and reparations are essential parts of this process as well. Disaggregated data are necessary for governments to take meaningful and impactful actions if they want to move towards a really and truly just and equal world. We also, disaggregated data helps to governments to achieve the sustainable development goals, that, and when we are also thinking about situations that go beyond the material conditions, we also need to recognize the many and diverse contributions of people of African descent to societies around the world. As Januaro Garcia, a very important Black Brazilian photographer, used to say, there is a history of Black people without Brazil. However, there is no history of Brazil without Black people. And talking about Brazil, the country where I'm from, Brazil has well collected, developed, and analyzed disaggregated data when we are thinking about the situation of African descent, including when we are thinking about health. And I want to mention that Brazil and the US are the only countries in the Americas that do disaggregated data on health indicators. It is due to disaggregated data that we can understand how unequal Brazil is. And I would like to share just two examples. In São Paulo, the city where I'm from, people who are poor and live in poor areas are 10 times more likely to die from COVID than people that live in wealthy areas. Black São Paulo residents are also 62% more likely to die from COVID than white residents. Brazil also, unfortunately, has the highest maternal mortality case due to COVID in the world. 77% of pregnant women that died due to COVID are Brazilians. I also would like to share some important disaggregated data when we are thinking about the different violence that women and girls face. When we are thinking about reproductive justice and sexual and reproductive rights, we also need to think about sexual violence, but also political violence, as well as economic violence that women and girls face, including, I want to share, when we are thinking about police brutality. Brazil today has more than 20 million COVID cases, and unfortunately, we are reaching about 100,000 people that die. However, police brutality persists and actually increased during the COVID times. And I want to share my last data that says that according to the Fogo Cruzado platform, since 2017, only the Rio police, not only the national police as a whole, but in one city of Brazil, more than 700 women, including 15 pregnant women, were killed by the Rio police. And here, I would like to mention the name of Kathleen Romeo. She was 24 years old. She was going to visit her grandmother when she got shot in Rio, which promoted a series of national protests around the country. And to finalize my comment, I also would like to mention that children, especially girls, also suffer from police brutality. Between 2017 and 2019, the Brazilian police killed more than 2,000 children, including several little girls and babies. And this is also part of the reproductive justice framework. To finalize, I would like to say the name of 3 little girls that were killed by the Brazilian police when they were playing in front of their house. Jennifer Gomes, 11 years old, Agatha Vitória, 8 years old, Kathleen de Oliveira Gomes, 5 years old. Thank you so much.
Natalia, thank you so much for this important contribution. I think we are in a space where we make assumptions about universality. I have been hearing for 1.5 years now how COVID affects everybody, how it affects people equally. And we hear it despite clear data that shows racial disparities, despite clear data that's showing the accompaniment of police brutality with, against some of the people at the highest risks for COVID. And we've seen, as you're saying, this tragic and unforgivable impact to children. So I appreciate your focus on data in this context, because it doesn't always seem like it pulls at your heart, but it's the only way that we are seen in some of these spaces. We have actually now a short statement from Dr. Carl Austin, a faith leader who defends human rights. Dr. Austin is the co-founder of the Human Reproduction Research Center of Gorgas Memorial Institute for Health Studies in Panama. Let's take a look at Dr. Austin's statement, and then we'll move into our poem that we talked about earlier.
Soy el doctor Carl L. Austin, ginecobstetra, endocrinólogo reproductivo. Hay 3 puntos fundamentales de los cuales quisiera enfatizar. Ha habido mucho documentación sobre el estado de la situación de los migrantes. Eso persiste hoy día y quizás aún peor. Hay el concepto sobre la educación presencial, pese a que en aquel entonces no existía la pandemia, pero hubo la visión de presentar los puntos relacionados a eso. Y hay el aspecto relacionado con la esclavitud, la trata de personas, la situación del comercio sexual, que todavía persiste, y a pesar de los años que ha pasado desde este informe, al día de hoy todavía esos tópicos siguen estando presentes y muy presentes en nuestro diario vivir.
Hello, beautiful people, and hello, people from African descent. I am Vicky the Poet, your Afro poet. I would like to thank Dr. Natalia for this wonderful opportunity. Today, I'll be performing a poem entitled, Being Black is Gold, Living in Dark is Thing of the Old. Sit, relax, and enjoy as I perform. Across the Atlantic, there lies an ageless, gallant land called Africa. She is dressed with untold riches, and her breast with the tradition of the ancients. A land caressed with brave mysteries and embraced by tamed nature. Her footprints have been a torch in tunnels and direction signs at every turn ends. Her tall mountains, adoring savannas, upright trees, stretching and curving rivers are only a pinch of her tasty meal. In her children, she breathes life, and the legacy of her valiant warriors she embalms for a lifetime. Her sons and fearless daughters build the Western Empire with a tool called unity, with just their bare hands. Her uniqueness was extracted from blackness. No wonder she glows even in darkness. She has survived the rage out of Noah's Ark. She has withstood spit from angry dragons. And amidst the taunts, she still stood her ground and never let go of her supreme crown. She is the home of the sun, but these days her clouds is robed in darkness. From afar, she seems slack, but what is stuck in her bosom is like an oxygen, so sufficient for us all to share. These days she bleeds with her sisters across the Pacific, to be specific, Asia, Europe, North America, South America, Antarctica, Oceania, and Australia. They cried endlessly because they have been tied with indestructible rope by their sons and daughters. To make this world once again a better place, and to stitch smile on her crying face. Let us turn our back to this world that has strange unity over entity. A world that chooses colors over hearts. A world that has no value for nature. A world nurturing its own destruction. Pack your bags, grab your things, and flee with me from this world and banish its thoughts. Let us go back to the old ways and borrow the tool called unity from our ancestors. Let us replace a device called me with an engine called we. Let us melt our differences with the very heat that cook our hatred. Our colors might be different, but our hearts beat the same. Our ways might be unique in their ways, but our lungs breathe the same. What is meant for all should not be given to few. The birds, they are of different colors, shapes and size, but they own and dwell in the sky in harmony. No wonder where I came from. Very early in the morning, they do sing songs of harmony and pleasant melody. Let go of your abode. Withdraw the keys from your robe and unlock your heart. Fill its room with love and oneness. Let go of your feast and open your hands for embrace. In your eyes, what is yours I will see as mine. And in my eyes, what is mine you will see as yours. I am yours truly, Vicky. Thank you, UNFPA Sierra Leone.
So, yes. So thank you to Vicky for sharing with us this moment of culture. We would like to close out our panel with just a closing thought from each panelist. You get 60 seconds. I realize this is almost criminal, yet I'm going to ask folks to really just give us one closing thought. And as we move to the final closing sessions, we'll start with Ana Paula Barreto. Ana?
That's so difficult to start. All right, thank you. Well, first I would like to thank for this opportunity. I really want to say that when we are thinking about people of African descent and structural forms of oppression, we cannot put ourselves in boxes. So we need to think beyond the boxes. And when we're thinking about reproductive justice, everything is about reproductive justice. So police violence, sexual violence, political violence, that's all connected. And I really would like to see us moving to this framework.
Powerful. Thank you. Dr. Marta Moreno Vega.
Well, in keeping with Durban vision, right, of culture, I think that we need to understand that the hacia that we have carried to all of our communities and distributed throughout our neighborhoods and families, and it persists, that we need to weave together a way of seeing ourselves that is different and build institutions that are based in that aesthetic, in our way of seeing the world. It doesn't mean we give up our jobs someplace else because we all need to survive. But the reality is, if we don't build our own, we remain with the same conversations over and over again, because these other institutions were designed to maintain white supremacy and keep the other on the margins.
Amazing. So true. Amazing. Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, a closing thought. Oh, we may have lost Professor Beckles. Oh, no,
okay. Yeah. Thank you, Dominique. I believe it's going to be important to step up our advocacy in much the same way that we did in the build up to Durban. There was a lot of work we did in the year or two before Durban. We now need to step up that global advocacy once again around the issue for a second decade and to focus on education, public health as critical. So we have to have a strong advocacy movement demanding the second decade. Already Caribbean prime ministers are talking about this. They're speaking at the UN next week. These are some of the ideas that I want to be on the agenda at the UN. So all of us should rally to keep the focus around the post-Durban declarations.
Amazing. Thank you, Professor Beckles. Ms.
Thank you.
Baca? A closing thought, 60 seconds, please.
Ok, en estos días estaba viendo la cumbre de CARICOM con el África y me llamó mucho la atención porque yo creo que parte del camino que hay que recorrer es eso. Hay que crear un continente fuerte porque ese continente es parte de la solución de los problemas que nosotros seguimos padeciendo aquí en la diáspora. Creo que lo importante no es que somos afrodescendientes porque venimos del África, sino porque el África está dentro de todos nosotros.
That's beautiful. Africa is within us. Thank you, Professor Maloney. Susana Baca, a closing thought, if you will, for 1 minute. And I think you need to unmute, or perhaps the moderator can help you and unmute for you. Great, go ahead, Ms. Baca. Yes, please go ahead.
Recuento de lo que hemos vivido hace muchos años. Brasil, el 18 de noviembre de 2001. No, 2011, querida, 2011. Entonces, nosotros continuamos ese camino y persistimos todos líderes afrodescendientes, líderes de la diáspora, todos estamos en ese defender nuestra identidad, nuestra diversidad, porque aquí en el Perú nos hemos mezclado tremendamente con chinos, con indígenas, entre afrodescendientes, y entonces hay una diversidad tremenda que es una riqueza que se da la presencia de esa riqueza en todas nuestras manifestaciones, en las manifestaciones artísticas, en el transmitir cultura hacia el mundo, y también nos hace un país difícil, y pasamos crisis políticas muy fuertes, como la última que hemos pasado, y que se ha visto la discriminación así, pero de todos los días contra la mujer, contra los indígenas, contra los amazónicos, contra los afrodescendientes, contra los de creencias diferentes. Y entonces tenemos que seguir luchando en el mundo hasta el último respiro que tengamos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Ms. Baca. Thank you, Ms. Baca, very much. There is so much strength in our diversity, and also it is such a space to keep negotiating. I'd like to thank you all for this important conversation. We would ask Dr. Kennem for some closing remarks to really round out this important dialogue. Dr. Kennem, if you're there, please do take the floor.
Thank you so much, Dominique. This has been an outstanding set of discussions in this global dialogue. The momentum is building towards leaving no one behind. And the list is long. And Afrodescendientes are on that list, strategizing with others. As Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, said regarding the historic first International Day for People of African Descent, quote, acknowledging the entrenched legacy of enslavement, redressing the wrongs of history, and shattering the evil lie of supremacy demands persistence and action every day, at every level, in every society, end quote. So as we reflect and as we mark the 20th anniversary of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, it is clear that we've had successes. But we also have to thank those of you who persevere in the understanding that we can never lose sight of the injustice and the suffering that still exists for many people of African descent across the globe. The General Assembly debate will take place on the 22nd of September regarding the 20th of Durban, and CARICOM is leading in that discussion, and we thank them, while noting that 2024 is drawing closer and closer, and that is the close of the current decade of action. So now that the Permanent Forum of People of African Descent has been established unanimously, we must also acknowledge that continuing the push for collective investments in those programs, in those policies, in that legislation that will advance the rights of people of African descent is of eminent and imminent importance, especially as we demand equal treatment during a pandemic, whereas we've heard repeatedly people of African descent have suffered disproportionately. I would like to acknowledge the leadership from the government of Costa Rica in particular, the vision of the president and the vice president, Madame Epsi Campbell-Barr, for global leadership in establishing the historic First International Day for People of African Descent, which was celebrated in conjunction with participants from Africa. Lastly, young people who have been a catalyst for much of the momentum we have seen over the millennia need to be promoted as they continue to make clear that peace and justice go hand in hand. I must also acknowledge and praise the valiant leadership of those warrior women who have kept racial and reproductive justice high on our agenda. At the Nairobi summit, marking the 25th anniversary of ICPD, the world made political commitments, financial commitments, and policy commitments to leave no one behind and to reach the furthest behind first, specifically all people of African descent. And I believe that while we move forward, the intersecting forms of discrimination that continue to endanger lives and livelihood speak to a moment where we have to continue to galvanize action, where we need to continue to go together with people of African descent, indigenous peoples, migrants, people living with disabilities, people living with HIV and AIDS, and especially women, girls, and young people to see a successful close to this urgent priority to assure that people of African descent will lead rather than being left behind. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kennem, for this important wrap up that you've given us. So as we close out and sort of bask in the words of our panelists and of Natalia Kennem, I'm going to invite you to watch a short documentary. It's just about 5 minutes, entitled Back to Our Roots, followed by a musical performance of the same name. It's set in the paradise of Cahuita on the Caribbean coast of Costa Rica, and it tells how Calypso music became the voice of a growing people as a symbol of protest and struggle. The song, performed by the group Calypso Kawe from Costa Rica, it's written by Danny Williams, and it speaks of the importance of recovering our roots, our cultures, and our traditions, and keeping the memories of our ancestors alive. So thank you all for joining us today. My most sincere thanks to our panelists, to Dr. Natalia Kennem, and to all of you for your engagement in this incredibly important dialogue on the 20th anniversary of Durban. And please do sit back and watch the documentary and the musical performance to close us out.
To be a calypsonia, you must know the rules.
El calipso viene de nuestros antepasados leanos. Es una herencia ancestral, musical, que considero que se debe preservar.
Cuando hablamos del calipso, estamos hablando de mi historia. El calipso es la historia de un pueblo que vino creciendo, Entonces muchas veces cuando uno quiere saber de su historia, lo único que tiene que hacer es sentarse a escuchar música. En nuestro caso, el calipso.
Para mí el calipso era la voz de un pueblo que hablaba. Era una protesta, era como alzar la voz de lo que estaba pasando realmente.
Desde nuestra existencia hemos tenido que estar en una lucha permanente. Número 1, la esclavitud. Número 2, la discriminación. Los afro o los negros han sido minoría tanto en la educación, en las oportunidades. Entonces debe ser una lucha constante.
Claro, el racismo todavía está. La falta de acceso, las desigualdades, todo eso está y van a seguir persistiendo. Entonces, muchas veces para nosotros poder obtener lo que necesitamos, hay que alzar la voz. Y es muy necesario que las personas afrodescendientes lo hagan, pues es la forma en la que podemos lograr nuestra libertad.
Es que antes de hablar de afrodescendientes, hablamos de seres humanos. Porque todos somos seres humanos y lo que tratamos de hacer con esto es que no haya división por el color de mi piel, sino que todos somos hijos de un Dios.
Soy felizmente una joven afrocostarricense y saber que llevo mi país en mi corazón, en mi mente y en mi lucha. Y decir que soy afrocostarricense me llena de orgullo. Yo celebro estas fechas con amor, con gritos, con cantos, porque es un día que me representa, es un día que representa a mi pueblo, es un día que representa mi lucha y mi libertad.
A mí me emociona escribir de nuestra historia más allá. Y siento que la unión es parte de cualquier ser humano que quiere avanzar hacia lo positivo. My people are people, get back to our roots. We have to unite because it's the only way we can win the fight. Entonces, cuando se habla de unite, de unirnos, es por luchar por nuestros derechos en un buen sentido de la palabra. No vamos a hacer guerra, no vamos a pelear. Y siempre con cosas positivas, con ritmos alegres, porque sentimos que la música alegra el alma. Sentimos que el calipso está con su efervescencia y necesitamos ese empujón para mantenerlo con vida y así vamos a tener viva la memoria de nuestros antepasados.
Because
Yeah, it was